Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Rhiannon, and I work at Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research, and I'll be hosting this webinar today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and recognise that these lands have always been places of learning. I pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play in responding to domestic and family violence. Before we get started today, I'd just like to cover a couple of questions that have come up in our recent webinars. If you would like to ask a question today, there's a Q&A chat function available. You should see a Q&A chat icon on your screen once you're logged in. So if you do have a question throughout the webinar, just pop it in there. And when we get to the end of the webinar, Jatinder will respond to questions. The webinar will be recorded and made available after the event. And we will upload that onto our website, www.noviolence.org.au. If you do experience any technical difficulties in accessing Zoom webinar, I would say initially contact your internal IT support to make sure that the system is able to be used. If you're still having difficulties, you can dial in via the phone number which is provided in your registration email. And finally, due to the high number of participants that we've been getting at our webinars, we are not able to provide certificates for this webinar. All right, I would now like to introduce your speaker today, Jatinder Kaur. Jatinder is an expert in domestic and family violence, and particularly in working with culturally and linguistically diverse groups. She has more than 15 years of experience working in policy research and social work practice, and she's focused on increasing knowledge of issues that are facing migrant and refugee communities and really bridging the gap between those communities and mainstream support services. She's also currently completing her PhD, which is an examination of family violence within Indian communities in Australia. I'm sure you're all really excited to hear from Jatinder, so I will pass over to her now. Enjoy your webinar.
Hey, thank you, Rhiannon, for that introduction. I would like to also thank the Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research Centre to give me this opportunity to present on this webinar. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal elders past and present and the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet here today, and certainly the importance of culturally safe practice and culturally responsive practice. Today's webinar is going to be focusing on a number of particular issues faced by migrant and refugee women within the Australian context. So we will be talking about vulnerabilities, risk factors. I will focus also on doing holistic biopsychosocial assessments when working with migrant and refugee victims of intimate partner violence or domestic violence. We will be also touching on cultural, linguistic and religious factors, and what are the barriers and challenges associated with intimate partner violence. We'll have a closer examination on what are some of the physical, mental health and sexual reproductive trauma and treatment options specific to migrant refugee women who are victims of intimate partner violence. And there will be an opportunity at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. 45 minutes is not enough time to cover all of this, the topics, so I will try to endeavour to cover the key points. However, I am using a bit of caution here that, yes, this is a lot more in-depth material and information and requires probably further access to readings and resources. So the first aspect of the key thing that I'd like to touch on is communication and language barriers. Migrant and refugee communities or women may not be able to speak English proficiently when they first arrive to Australia. So professionals, whether you are in the medical field, nursing, allied health, or in the domestic violence sector, it's really absolutely critical to know how to access interpreter services when providing crisis intervention or health treatment assessments for clients who are from non-English speaking background. Now, the reason why I highlight this point as the first point is that in a number of domestic violence victims that I have been supporting over the last number of years, is that when I ask them why did they not tell of their abuse earlier on, they have told me that many times their husbands would insist on attending the medical appointment when they were talking to the doctor to get treatment for their bruises or injuries, and that their husband or partner actually stopped them from making disclosures. So this is a critical point that I really need to emphasize for all professionals when working with vulnerable women, is that ensuring that she has the opportunity one-on-one to be able to seek adequate healthcare treatment. Also, for those of you who may not be aware of, TIS National is the national provider for interpreter services, and medical practitioners, nurse practice staff, pharmacies and NGOs are eligible for free interpreter services. So I've provided you with the links. So I would encourage you, if you don't already have this as part of your practice, to look at how your practice can register for this service. Newly arrived to Australia. So for many migrant and refugee women who are newly arrived, whether they've been in Australia for 1 month, 6 months, 2 years, may not be familiar with a number of these provisions. These include the domestic and violence protections, which are in our Queensland legislation, how to access social welfare support services, so whether that is the DV support services or Centrelink or housing or tenancy, or even counselling services. The role of police, and I will go into a bit more detail a bit later on, but it is really important to reflect on that in some countries where migrant refugee women come from, police have used a very authoritarian approach when working with women, and so they may be fearful of going to the police to seek help and assistance. Medical, a lot of newly arrived women don't know where to get access or go to the doctor, or whether the GP is fully equipped to meet the needs of migrant and refugee women. Legal or the criminal justice system. A lot of newly arrived migrant refugee women don't know how to navigate the court systems, so even where to get free legal advice or how to access legal aid. And immigration issues, and I will go into more detail a bit later on, that is a really big barrier, an issue faced by a lot of migrant refugee women if they have a temporary visa status. Women's right in country of origin. So one of the key things that I'd like to sort of highlight is that for some of the migrant and refugee women who come to Australia, in their country of origin, they may not have laws that exist for their protection or domestic violence or sexual assault. So they may not think of intimate partner violence as abuse. So that's an issue that we have in making sure that newly arrived community groups are given that information about what services, what are the laws in Australia. Other vulnerable factors, particularly for refugee or asylum seeker women, includes sexual violence, rape, assault, and their experience of that during the war or conflict, or also in the detention centres or transit countries or in the refugee camps. Female genital mutilation is also a practice which occurs within the African Middle Eastern communities. So that is also a key issue for practitioners and professionals to be aware of and understand the vulnerability there. Refugee and complex trauma, so mental health, particularly around post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorders, or severe anxiety, and how does that impact on their ability to also seek health treatment. Another cohort is young girls also from particular refugee or asylum seeker backgrounds being more vulnerable to childhood sexual abuse or assault, particularly during the, escaping the war and the conflict, refugee camps, detention centres or transit countries. So in this section, really wanted to highlight, and we will spend a bit of time in talking about this framework, which is from the World Health Organization Global Study on Violence Against Women conducted in 2013. It is the first global study which looked at intimate partner violence across a number of countries, I think over 50 countries worldwide, and what they found was 30% of women worldwide had experienced intimate partner violence. The key emphasis or findings from this study was that for the health sector, it was training to recognise when women may be at risk of intimate partner violence and how to provide appropriate response. So that is why I've used this framework in today's webinar, because we've got a number of different professionals accessing this webinar. So what I'd like to sort of touch on, and I'm using the arrow here, is there's three aspects. So this diagram actually shows the different pathways and health effects of intimate partner violence at the top here. So the first aspect is physical trauma. So this would be typically any type of injury, musculoskeletal, soft tissue, genital trauma, broken bones, lacerations. And then what can be the consequence of that injury can be a potential disability. So certainly for some of the women that I've supported, if they've experienced severe head trauma, that has also led to an acquired brain injury. In the second aspect here, we're talking about psychological trauma or stress. So the implications of that is significant mental health problems. So in a large proportion of the victims that I support, they present with severe anxiety, depression, PTSD, eating disorders, and also suicidality. Then we also have an implication of that could be potentially substance use, alcohol and other drugs or tobacco. There are two other consequences here with non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular disease, hypertension, high blood pressure, diabetes, poor eating. And then you've got the somatoform, which includes irritable bowel, chronic pain or chronic pelvic pain. The pain symptoms is quite significant. So what I've seen in some of my clients is that where they receive severe injuries, they also have what could be described as phantom pain or chronic pain in that part of that body. So these issues can also lead to disability as well. And in the third column here, we've got fear and control, or also coercive control. There's two aspects of here. So we would have first here is limited sexual and reproductive control. So that is a lack of contraception or unsafe sex, which then leads to sexual reproductive health of unwanted pregnancy, abortion, HIV, other STIs, gynecological problems. On the other side, we've got healthcare seeking, lack of autonomy, difficulty seeking care and other services, which can then also have implications for perinatal maternal health. So if the pregnancy goes to full term, what we do see is that due to the stress or ongoing stress, sometimes babies are born premature, they have low birth weight, they're quite irritable, and in some cases we also see miscarriages. So that also can contribute to death, including homicide, suicide or other. So using that framework from the World Health Organization, I wanted to unpack, well, what does that mean for migrant and refugee women? So for migrant refugee women, particularly for physical trauma, what we typically might see is injuries, soft tissue, genital trauma, bruises, broken bones, lacerations causing permanent disability or death. Now, it all depends on how they present. So sometimes they may be taken to the hospital by ambulance, paramedics, or they might go to the doctor, GP, taken by their husband after a few days when the bruising or swelling or the marks have gone down. If they've had multiple presentations to a doctor's surgery or hospital, we need to capture how these injuries have been sustained and whether the husband or the partner is not allowing the disclosure of abuse. So my key question here to practitioners and professionals is whether your 50 minutes that you have per patient, is it long enough to ensure that you're able to undertake a comprehensive assessment? And I understand that we are all busy people, but what we find is when we are rushed and we are time limited, we miss key things or key indicators which may indicate significant abuse and trauma down the track. Also, I'd like to highlight here that the long-term impact of untreated injuries can play a significant impact on women's health and well-being many years after she has left the domestic violence relationship. So even doing a good developmental history or comprehensive history, if the patient is not known to you, that can also help you understand what the current implications are to their current health and well-being. The second aspect, which is around psychological trauma. So this is an area that I do a lot of work with, and working in, I get a lot of referrals by GPs or under the mental health care plan. So typically I see quite a lot of women who present with really high levels of anxiety, depression, PTSD, eating disorders, and sometimes suicidality. They don't necessarily use alcohol, drugs, or tobacco, but some women may do. But what we see as a critical issue is that when it comes to mental health, many migrant refugee women, there is a lot of stigma and there's a low level of knowledge in understanding how to seek treatment for mental health. So there's poor literacy around what is mental health, what is anxiety, how to seek treatment for whether to see a doctor, a GP, a psychiatrist, and access counselling. So the other aspects of non-communicable diseases of hypertension, sleep apnea, cardiovascular disease, fast heart rate, or all of the somatoform symptoms, typically I will see all of that as well as the mental health. So as part of working within a GP practice, I also provide that information to the GP to look at, okay, can we ensure that we do a women's health check? Can we get the other symptoms treated, particularly around sleep or poor eating, and managing those symptoms so that they can start to get onto the normal baseline? So second question again, we need to ensure that we allocate enough time to do a comprehensive assessment. The third aspect around fear and coercive control, this is probably another one that I really find that a lot of victims really, really struggle. So when we work with migrant and refugee women, anything to do with sex, sexual health is taboo. A lot of these women in their country of origin were never given adequate training or knowledge or information during their high school years or university years about reproductive health, women's health, what is consent, and what is, how to navigate their sexual health. And typically then their husband can be their first partner, so they don't have experience or knowledge in how to navigate this space. So due to those issues, what we find is that they can also become victims of coercive control, where particularly in some situations I've seen husbands or partners intentionally try to make the women, their wives, pregnant so that they are trapped and cannot leave the relationship. So lack of contraception, unsafe sex, unwanted pregnancy or abortion, HIV, other STIs, or gynecological problems. I've seen a lot of that come up when there's been some really rough sex or real significant trauma there. Other things that I probably do want to highlight is that for some women, performing certain sexual acts, including oral or anal sex, can be very traumatic, and there's a lot of stigma around that. So if that was part of the domestic violence or intimate partner violence, they may not be willing to disclose that because there's a lot of shame around that. With some of the women who have then gone on to have children, certainly I've seen high rates of postnatal depression, babies being born premature. And so again, I'd like to just emphasize that it is absolutely critical. The key message today is to ensure that these women have autonomy and are able to have that one-on-one session with their doctor, nurse, allied health professional without feeling that they are being controlled or manipulated or coerced by their husband or partner to not make those disclosures. So given that we may have a number of professionals, I thought it would be helpful to use two different case studies to highlight some of this model that the World Health Organization has developed. So in this case study, this is an Indian migrant victim of intimate partner violence. Both of these cases are based on real cases that I've worked with their names changed. So Sonia is a 25-year-old woman. She's brought into the GP clinic by her husband. She has a broken arm, bruises on her hands and wrists back in December 2018. She's new to Australia and could not speak English well, so she speaks Hindi. When asked by the doctor how she got the injury, the husband replied that she fell. So Sonia was not able to tell the doctor that her husband had twisted her arm and that she had been in pain for 2 days. He also refuses to leave her bedside. She's not been able to tell nurses that she's anxious and not been able to sleep at night and has stopped eating regularly. Eventually at work, her friends give her the DV Connect number. She's able to call them in private and seek advice on how to get help. 6 months later, she is able to make an appointment with an Indian female doctor and is able to speak to her about what has been happening and is provided with a referral to a therapist who speaks the same language. So that's an example of, of an Indian migrant and how that can play out. The second case study that we have here is from a Somali refugee background. So Zamina is a 17-year-old who came to Australia under the refugee program. She has 4 siblings and is the eldest. No father, mother is going to TAFE for English classes. Her family are Muslim and the mother wears a hijab, so they're quite devout in their faith. So while her mother is at TAFE, she was home alone. Her uncle came over to her house and sexually assaulted her. She was too ashamed and never told her mother what happened. After a few months, she started getting sick at school. Her friends took her to see a child health nurse. They did a pregnancy test which showed she was pregnant. Zamina was too afraid to go to the police and report her uncle as he was a community leader. Her mother kicked her out as she had brought shame on the family and blamed her for the sexual assault. And then she became homeless. That's where she got linked into support service by police, which helped her through her pregnancy, find accommodation, access medical treatment and counselling. So Zamina's case, is probably a bit more on the severe side, but I guess I used this example to highlight that for some newly arrived refugee families, there is sometimes a lack of awareness around protections or what is, child safe, lack of understanding around reproductive health, and also the concepts of shame and honour, and blaming Zamina for something that was not her fault. She was a victim, and then her being ostracised. This is a real case. It's from a project that I've done with a homelessness women's service. So in practice, some of these cases don't come into light because there's a lot of shame and stigma in talking about the trauma that they may have experienced. So this brings us to what are the barriers to help seeking. So in highlighting those 2 case studies, I wanted to just highlight the different nuances that a lot of migrant and refugee women experience, and particularly what the challenges they may face. So some of the cultural factors and gender roles within some migrant and refugee communities, there may be some very strong patriarchal beliefs, particularly around the husband having the right to discipline the wife, controlling her movements, controlling the money, controlling who she can and cannot talk to, particularly having access to a mobile phone. And so those can be key parts of the cultural aspect. And the barriers to seeking help can also be around the fear of being ostracized or bringing shame to the family or community. So we don't talk about our dirty laundry outside of our own home. And that can be used then to continue and perpetuate the abuse for many years in some community groups. The gender roles, in some very traditional patriarchal cultures, the women are raised to be or the girls are raised to be subservient to the husband. They are raised to obey the husband and to do whatever is within her control to please the husband. So when they become victims of intimate partner violence, what I've seen is that in the community, she is blamed. Okay, she is blamed that she couldn't adjust in the family, she couldn't please her husband, she didn't serve the in-laws. So there's a lot of victim blaming that happens in the community, and certainly I've seen that within my own Indian community as well. In some cultures, there can be a very low position for the women in the community. So that is tied into the gender aspect. So in some cultures, boys are preferred over girls. So, you know, having a male child is preferable. Having a girl child is seen as a burden on the family. And that can also have implications then to, you know, gender selection and abortions as well. Linguistic, so language barriers, migrant refugee women struggling to speak or understand English proficiently and disclose the abuse. So this is probably a key point that I do want to highlight. And I do a lot of work and I support a lot of women when they are making statements to police. It is really, really important to have interpreters there that are adequately qualified and trained, who understand what is domestic and family violence. A lot of women won't fully tell what has happened because there's also a fear about what will be the repercussions. I've included religious here, and in some sectors in the community and faith communities, there will be some resistance, but particularly there are some faiths that have religious texts of sanctioning or beating of the wife for discipline reasons. And there's a lot of shame around divorce and separation. Certainly I am aware of there's some texts within the Bible and the Quran that do have those scriptures in there. So if the women are potentially seeking help from their priest or the imam, and they then tell them, no, it is your fate, it is your duty to serve the husband, they may not then be willing to seek further help. And also if they do become divorced or separated, they also then lose that sense of community and sense of belonging as well. Immigration. So immigration is probably one of the biggest barriers that I've seen in a lot of the victims that I have supported. The nature of, typically what we see is that a husband who may have Australian citizenship or permanent residency from a migrant refugee background will then go back to their country of origin and seek a bride from their community and cultural group. So, and then they bring over the bride who is on a temporary spouse visa. When they arrive here, sometimes if it's a long delay in the temporary spouse visa, they may come to Australia under a tourist or a visitor visa as well. If what happens is, if they're on a temporary visa, the husband or the partner uses their temporary visa status to threaten them. So if you disclose the abuse, I will deport you. I will tell immigration. And so this is a really big fear that the women, particularly migrant refugee women, have, that they have no way, or they don't know how to seek help from a migration agent or from a migration lawyer. The other part of this is also that the husband or the husband's family can make significant threats to her family, whether they are in Australia or back in their country. And so because of those threats to kill, that can also pose a significant barrier to seek help. So police and the court system or the criminal justice system, for some migrant and refugee women, there is a genuine fear of police and police authorities. So that is tied into potentially their lived experience of the authoritarian role or oppressive role of police and law enforcement in their country of origin. So we do see that because of that fear, there is a reluctance of, no, we don't call police, we don't bring shame. There's also fear of then sending the husband to jail, because then the community puts a lot of pressure on the victim to withdraw her case so that the husband would not go to jail. There's also issues if the husband is a breadwinner. So what I've seen also, that it is quite frustrating for police when women, as a case has progressed closer to the court hearing date, they withdraw their statement, and it becomes extremely difficult to then prosecute some of these cases. So we may see very high levels of domestic violence incidences, but then that does not necessarily translate to a large proportion of those being granted domestic violence permanent protection orders. So we've already talked about the barriers of being newly arrived, not being familiar with the Australian laws around domestic violence protections, social welfare system, how to access a refuge, housing options, child custody and support. I can tell you a lot of my work is spent in helping these women, these victims, navigate multiple complex systems, which is very difficult and very onerous. And sometimes they just give up because it's so hard and difficult. So what can we do? In part of the focus of this webinar today is to upskill and raise awareness for professionals working in various settings in how to support and meet the needs of migrant refugee women who become victims of intimate partner violence. So I'm not telling you to, I'm assuming that all of you will have your own organisational risk assessment frameworks now in supporting victims of domestic violence. But particularly for migrant refugee women, I would be asking you to sort of look at, do you ask those questions around English language proficiency and then ensure interpreters allocated. Really, really critical to match for gender and dialect. Majority of migrant refugee women will have a preference to talk to a female. There is a lot of resistance and shame and stigma, and also the norms around modesty to not be comfortable in talking to a male professional. Does a client know how to make a safety plan? This might be a very foreign thing for them. So explaining what is a safety plan in simple language. What support services are being used by the client? Are they linked into any support services? Do they know where to get help? What type of access or support does a victim have? Does she have any family or friends or neighbours? Quite a large number of the women that I have supported have been isolated, where they have not known anyone in Australia. And then that also enables the abuse to continue for quite a significant period. Are there children at risk of being hurt or witnessing the violence? A lot of this information also is really important to look at. What levels of violence is happening in the home? Have they contacted police? Are they willing to contact police? Do they know how to apply for a domestic violence application order? Like, what is the process? And also, are they familiar or are they informed about, if there's immigration issues, how to access the family violence provisions in the Migration Act, and to access community legal advice and support. So, what would be my tips to working with migrant refugee women who are victims of intimate partner violence? Absolutely critical is to build trust and rapport. It's very traumatic for victims to speak of the abuse, particularly if the abuse has been occurring for a number of months or even years. Sometimes I'm really astonished at times when I meet some women who've been victims for 10, 15 years and they've never told anyone about what they've gone through. So if you can imagine, they've been carrying that trauma for so many years. That is not an easy thing for them to start to unpack and disclose what has happened in their life. Really critical to take the time and create a safe environment. How do you ensure that you engage with the client in a culturally responsive and a safe way so that they are able to make these disclosures, are able to feel comfortable to talk about what has happened? Being mindful of gender, many migrant refugee women will not speak or seek treatment from a male professionals. So having a look at where you can, having a female to accompany you when trying to get that information. Safety planning, so informing them of their choices, how they can seek help in the future. Look, one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in the system is that it can take a number of times, months and years for some victims to leave an abusive relationship. So any type of involvement or intervention or conversation you have can also be around how can we upskill or inform them of their options, their rights, and how to, for them to be able to re-engage with you at a later time, at a later date. And providing appropriate referrals to services who have capacity to provide culturally responsive support. So I think in Queensland, we are going to see that there are challenges, particularly if you're in more of the regional locations where there's not a lot of services compared to the Brisbane Southeast area. I do think we do have a long way to go in ensuring that we utilise our bilingual multicultural workforce to the full capacity to be able to meet the needs of migrant refugee women. So for those of you who are seeking or needing to know or weren't aware of, there are some resources. Yes, they are Queensland based, and I'll talk a little bit about the Australian Government Safety Pack too. So in Queensland, we've got the Queensland Transcultural Mental Health Service. This is statewide. Do Google search, that's their phone number. We have the Immigrant Women Support Service, even the Brisbane based, they can always still provide you some advice as well if you're in the regional areas. The Australian government, a couple of years back, developed what's called the Family Safety Pack, which covers intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, dowry, and other types of abuse. It is translated into 46 languages, and also has a pictorial storyboard. So this can be quite useful if you don't have or can't get an interpreter straight away. Go onto that website, print off that information that's in their language, and you can use that to at least start the conversation to sort of find out, is intimate partner violence or sexual assault part of what's impacting on that victim. And that's it, folks. So yes, so we're up for questions and answers now.
Thank you, Jatinder, for that wonderful presentation. We are going to head straight into questions. We've had a couple come through already. So if you're ready to go, Jatinder?
Sure. Yeah.
Our first question, how do we improve the evidence base for understanding prevalence of intimate partner violence in ethnic minority communities?
Okay, so for this question, we need to look at data which is collected by first responders. So what I would like to put it out there is that police, the domestic violence sector, emergency department, hospital system, they are what's called the first responders. So we can, you know, ask those agencies in the first instance to start to capture ethnicity. When we're looking at DV prevalence, we need to look at those domestic violence incidences in the first aspect. Those questions could be around country of origin, language spoken, or the use of interpreter. Then after that, we can then examine domestic violence cases that are presented at local magistrate court and what percentage are from ethnic, migrant or refugee groups. I think it requires leadership from various government departments. It requires professionals who are working in the front line to be mindful that, you know, why it is important to collect this data. So let's see what happens. We have the National Action Plan around preventing violence against women, data collection and the issues faced by migrant refugee women is a key priority now as part of the third action plan.
That's great, thank you. Jatinder, what is the name of the interpreting service that you mentioned earlier in your talk?
Okay, so that's TIS National, TIS National. So the hyperlink will be on the website, but that's national, that's Australian government funded and covers Australia-wide.
Great, thank you. We've had another question come in from Bernadette. Apart from Rails, is there any other free immigration support for women who are experiencing intimate partner violence? Most of these women on temporary visas do not have access to any welfare payments and services. Immigration lawyers can be very unaffordable.
Yeah. So it's a tricky question. What I will say that they can certainly contact me. I have a migration agent who works with me in our DV refuge that we've set up for Indian women at the Women's Sahara House. So yes, he does charge a fee, but he will also work on a payment plan. He doesn't provide it for free, but he is willing to support particularly victims of intimate partner violence. So I think, you know, if you are struggling, particularly if you're in the different regions and you can't get access to Rails, certainly I'm more than happy to provide you with his details. You probably won't like that, but that's okay.
Thanks, Jatinder. We've got a question from Dorothy. Are there women who do not realise that they are in a violent relationship if culturally they believe that that is the norm?
Yes, yes. And it makes me very sad at times when particularly then they have been told or they sought advice from their community leaders or faith leaders and they've been told that this is their destiny, this is their fate, and it is their duty to please their husband. So unfortunately, I do come across those cases as well.
Thank you. One from Allison. What is your understanding of the risks of having a female interpreter from the same culture and community in relation to DV confidentiality and safety?
If it's a female interpreter from the same community and you're working in the same community, then I would probably request an interpreter interstate to mitigate that risk of confidentiality. I can speak, I'm a bilingual clinician, so certainly, you know, I'm always mindful then I'm from the same community, and if I'm servicing, you know, Indian women, they may not always want to talk to me. So I'll always give those options to them. So if confidentiality is a critical issue, then I would intentionally seek an interpreter out of state. Yeah.
Thank you. How do you ensure DV workers have culturally competent practices when coming across migrant women experiencing domestic violence?
Oh, the big question. Okay. Look, I think this webinar is the first step. So I can't talk to you about the university education system, but I think as increasingly, and we'll just focus on Queensland, is that our population is becoming increasingly diverse. So it requires leadership. It requires that agencies now start to recognise what are the demographics of clients accessing or seeking help, and how do we ensure that those professional development opportunities are given to staff who may not have had that opportunity in their university studies or post qualifying studies. So it is about recognising, okay, if we're starting to see a high proportion of migrant refugee women in our work, how do we ensure that our work in the DV sector is actually being culturally responsive to that cohort?
Thank you. Jatinder, what would be the key elements for developing a strengths-based approach as opposed to the widespread deficit approach to developing services and supports for women from ethnic minority communities?
Okay, it's a good question. So we need to look at developing more culturally appropriate relationship mediation counselling services. So one of the key challenges that I see in the system is that a lot of resources and funding is put into the tertiary pointy end, or when a woman separates. I will be honest here that a lot of migrant refugee women do not wish for their marriage to end or the relationship to end, but they want the abuse to stop. So we need to find a middle ground of how do we work with the men, how do we help them work on the relationship, particularly around healthy relationship, and how do we manage risk. So I'll be honest, I think there's a lot of work to be done in this space in developing culturally appropriate casework interventions, which work with both men and women, community groups, community leaders, faith groups, and education and upskilling. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a question now from Cindy. Do you have ideas on financial assistance for women on temporary spousal visas?
If they have work rights, I probably encourage them to try and find work. A lot of the women, if they are on temporary visa status and they are not eligible for the special benefit provided by Centrelink, because I think that you would need to speak to the social worker working in Centrelink to try and get them on the special benefit, but not everyone can access that. If they're on a temporary visa and they have work rights, I would be encouraging or empowering them to be able to look at what can they work in, whether it's in the restaurants, cleaning, any type of that, jobs that can be low-level skill, if there is not a high risk to their safety.
All right, we have a question from Alison. Some female clients in domestic violence relationships, notably financially abused, say they cannot afford solicitors and are unable to access free legal aid because of their husband's or the family's assets, which they are unable to access. How can they get legal support? Is it through Women's Legal Service?
That's a tricky one. I think, unfortunately, now what we've seen with the federal government, there's not been any new funding to the community legal centres. So in that situation, I would probably encourage the organisation to approach, Women's Legal Service, approach maybe, some of those lawyers, or even look at the Queensland Law Society if there's any lawyers that might be willing to do some pro bono cases. It's a tricky space because I know even with the victims that I've been supporting that they can't afford, $400 per hour to have a lawyer and then be able to also go through the local magistrate court for the domestic violence hearings as well as family law court. So it is a systems issue that needs to be raised and advocated on behalf of the sector. So if victims are falling through the cracks, I think that's where we need to highlight those issues to various government departments and actually look at how can we resolve those issues.
Definitely. A question from Beck. What is the eligibility criteria and application process regarding domestic violence permanent protection orders?
Okay, so the Migration Act, if you type into Google the family violence provisions in the Migration Act, currently the Australian government only allowed that provision to specific visas, which include the Partner 309 visa. So we have to the first aspect would be to look at what visa category is a woman on. If she's on a tourist visitor visa or a 457 dependent spouse visa, she won't be eligible for that. The recent Senate inquiry into dowry abuse handed down its final report in February this year, and it has 12 recommendations. And some of those key recommendations include for the Australian government to offer now a vulnerable women at risk visa category for any woman who becomes a victim of domestic and family violence here in Australia, to then be eligible for a woman at risk visa onshore for 2 years, which is a temporary visa. Because we're going to be facing an election, the Australian government hasn't yet, informed whether they're going to adopt those recommendations. But I'd encourage people to have a look at the Senate inquiry into dowry abuse, the final report, which is on their website.
Great, thanks, Jatinder. We have a question now from Tola. Do you think that calling migrant women called is a barrier to workers understanding migrant Australians?
I'll be honest, I actually don't like the term CALD, culturally and linguistically diverse. And hence why in the work that I do, or I try to use migrant and refugee, but then I know also for refugee communities, they don't like to have that continuous label of being called a refugee when they've been here more than 5 years. I don't know what is the adequate term. You could use multicultural communities, but we do need to have a term that describes, because the experiences of migrants coming to Australia and their settlement journey is very different to the refugee humanitarian groups or communities that come to Australia. So that's why we need to have that distinction, because refugees have access to settlement support services, and that's a very managed service program, whereas migrants who come from, whether it's coming from India or China or the Asia Pacific region, they don't have access to any settlement support. So that's why I kind of use that distinction of migrant and refugee groups. Ethnic minorities is another term that's used quite prevalent within the UK, some US and Canadian literature as well. So that's another term that is also being used to describe overall diverse cultures.
Thank you. Our next question is, where women are unwilling to leave a relationship due to cultural shame of divorce, for example, a previous divorce or being remarried, would you suggest as a support to link them into whilst maintaining the relationship? For example, particularly women from Indian communities, are there any statewide or Brisbane-based women's groups that they could join, which could assist them to evaluate their options in the longer term?
Yes, definitely. So certainly in more recent times, we are looking at upskilling community groups, whether they're from the Indian community associations or other cultural community groups, to build that capacity and knowledge, because not everyone is a social worker, not everyone is across domestic and family violence. So I think when we're looking at prevention, we need to upskill our diverse community groups in what is domestic and family violence. Once we do that initial awareness raising, then we can look at how do we find those solutions in the community for providing referrals, providing support, or linking into specialist services as well.
Thanks, Jatinder. Our next question is, you may have already spoken about this, but do you make contact or work with the Vulnerable Persons Unit at some police stations? As I have heard from some of them in my work that a lot of work is being done in assisting women from migrant backgrounds.
I do heaps of work with them. Across, because I'm based in Brisbane, I've certainly worked with Brisbane South, North, Ipswich, and Gold Coast. So, yes, and because of having the Women's Sahara Domestic Violence Refuge, I will also do that work with making sure and supporting them in making the statements and helping them through the court process. That's only for a very small cohort, but yes, the Vulnerable Persons Unit do fantastic work. Yeah.
Thanks, Linda. All right, we just have 2 more questions and then we might have to wrap it up. From Bernadette, do you have any suggestion on how to prevent stigmatisation of newly arrived women as mail order brides? These women experience domestic violence and are conscious of this labelling.
Yes, we have. That's a tricky one. The mail order brides. The stigma around that. I guess it's a matter of who's using that label and how is that label understood. It's a tricky one, Rhiannon. I'm trying to think. How do we work with that one? It's I would probably be working with the women to look at, well, how did they identify themselves and what language they want to use to be identified. And I think, yes, I don't think it's appropriate to have mail order bride on the paperwork. It's a tricky one because Australia has a history of, we had waves of mail order brides, whether it was from Vietnam or the Philippines or Asian. And so those women's experiences of intimate partner violence have not been captured because I've been doing a literature review in family violence, certainly in looking at what has been researched in Australia. We've got some significant gaps in understanding what does IPV look like within different cultural groups. And also underreporting in some cultural groups. So that's a tricky question, and I don't probably feel I'm quite well equipped to answer that one.
Thanks, Jatinder. And our lucky last question is from Sarah. Are you able to share any tips around how to be more culturally aware when working and speaking with men about their role as a father in the home?
Well, when working with men, it probably would help if you have a male worker with you, probably the first instance. Unfortunately, in our social welfare sector, it's a very female-dominant sector. Being culturally aware, working with men, I'd probably start with getting to know your clients. So don't go in with a mindset or being gung-ho and going straight to talking about the DV. You've got to form that trust and rapport and build that relationship. So, having a good idea about, okay, do your own research. So whether they're from the African background or Asian or Vietnamese or Indian, trying to find out, okay, well, where are they from? What might be some conversation starters? So whether it's cricket or sport or soccer or, I don't know, world events or something that you can form that relationship first, and then once they start to trust you over a period of time, then you can start to work on the key issues. And I'm using, I guess, my experience in working with Aboriginal communities in the remote, that it can take more than 6 months to build trust and rapport with some cultural groups. And I would say that with men, there may be huge resistance. There may be a huge reluctance, particularly if you're a female, that, they will feel like, they're being disempowered, their male masculinity is being challenged, the whole sense of manhood is being challenged. So we've still got a long way to go in this space of that, supporting men who exhibit violent behaviour, and how do we help them unlearn violence. Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of our webinar today. I'd really like to thank you, Jatinder, for sharing your expertise with us and giving your time to us today so that we can all learn about this important topic. And I'd like to thank everyone who joined us, and also for those who participated and asked questions as well. I hope you all enjoyed the webinar. And just a reminder that the webinar has been recorded, and this will be uploaded onto our website and made available in the coming days. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.